Well, thank you, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to very briefly introduce our guest today, Paulo Tan. He's going to speak to us on imagining and struggling toward enriching futures with disability in mathematics classrooms and beyond. In particular, focused on the roles of intersectional justice and anti-ableism. Very briefly, many of you have been on our calls before, so I'd like to just go over our norms. We encourage you to mute yourself.
Brian, your screen isn't showing.
It's not. Wow. Thank you guys for saying. Huh.
Do the presenter view.
Yeah, that was strange how that happened. Do you guys see it now? Yeah. Okay. So I just won't mess with presenting since I'll be quick. But I just wanted to remind you that most of the time, keep yourself muted. We find that just seems to work best. You're welcome, though, to unmute and ask questions. We tend to have smaller groups, so that seems to work fine. You're encouraged to rename yourself if you'd like. Feel free to leave your camera off while we're in the whole group. You can use the raise hand tool feature to be called on, or you can jot something in the chat that lets us know that you would like to speak. So this is, I think it might be our third year of running monthly NICCasts. This is meant to be an interactive meeting of our networked improvement community so that we're in a space where we're sharing ideas, lessons learned, or even provoke us with some new ideas like I think today might. Primarily toward a goal of building our community. These NICCast series are meant to build familiarity with aspects of networked improvement community change and research process, as well as I said earlier, build the community and a shared vision. By way of introducing our speaker today, Paulo Tan, in the past few years at my site at Kennesaw, have been engaged in ongoing conversations as my students have come to me and asked, in the INED course, those are our special education courses, they're telling us that explicit instruction is what we're supposed to use. And so it just started a really robust conversation between the math ed faculty and the INED faculty about what that meant. And it helped me realize when I look at AMTE standards, assumption 4, that multiple stakeholders must be responsible and invested in preparing teachers of math, those stakeholders just keep expanding and expanding for me. So I will be very brief and turn this over to Paulo. Paulo is here to speak with us for the next 55 minutes or so from the University of Missouri in St. Louis. He'll say a little bit more about himself, I'm sure, so I will stop and welcome Paulo.
Well, hello, everybody. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy day to be here. I really admire the work that you all are doing and really hope that today's presentation and discussion builds on the work that you are doing. And Brian and I have been in conversation about some of that work and some of the things you all been thinking about. So that is really the big aim of today. I want to share my slide deck there. You're able to view that okay? All right, thank you. So one thing I want to share a little bit about today for those who may not be as familiar with the scope and landscape of mathematics education and disability, I'll share a little bit of background and information about that, and then ask us to grapple with issues with this landscape, which I see as disability, ableism, and intersectionality. We're going to move then to a small group activity, and then I'll return to this notion of inclusion, which is part of the conversation that we have with disability in schools in general, and think about ways to go beyond this notion of inclusion, and think about an more anti-ableist approach to the work that we do, which I view as a thriving work, as a work of liberation, and that work is done in mathematics education as well as through mathematics education. So we'll go through, as I mentioned, a few activities, small group discussions. I'm going to present some overview of the work, but we'll start with some introductions and this idea of access needs, and I'll explain why I think that's important for us to think about. And if time allows, we'll close out with any questions, insights, and offerings that each of us might share during this time. Okay, so think about today as you join in this virtual space with us, what are your access needs? And so just reflect on that question for a few seconds, and I will share a little bit about what that means, or what I think that might mean. So this idea of beginning gatherings or meetings or presentations with this question of folks who are here in community, I really got this idea from Renee Taylor's book, The Body's Not an Apology. And so any of you familiar with that book here? See some head shakes. It's a really wonderful book that talks a lot about issues of race, disability, and as the title might suggest, the issues of the body. And in the body, as Taylor mentions, it's not just the body, it's also body mind. So that has a lot of implications for the work we do. And so access is really important as we think about in the space that we have. We'd often don't think about what our folks' access needs. We just make those assumptions. So in the meeting where we're virtually, we assume, okay, everybody will be able to see the slides. Everybody will be able to hear. There will be no need for interpreters. That might be asked ahead of time. And so beyond that, like, what are other access needs? So if you are comfortable sharing, feel free to share out via chat or come off mute. What might be some of your access needs at this time? This is 2 o'clock Central Time, right? 3 o'clock Eastern Time. Like someone from Hawaii, I think that's what, 5 hours or so in the morning. And so what do we think our access needs are? Again, if you feel comfortable, please do share. And again, we'll just take a moment here to think about and share out if you would like. Okay, Allison shared about sitting. Yep, that is fine. Feel that you all have been in meetings, Zoom meetings quite a bit, and know how to make sure those needs are being met. Any other share outs? Visual cues, okay. Thank you, Campy. Did I pronounce that name correctly? Okay, visual cues. Okay, yeah.
Yes, sorry.
Okay, any other? All right. So the idea is just take a moment and think about access, think about, again, in relation to the work that you all do, which is thinking about supporting secondary mathematics teachers programs, and what that might mean to making this something that we do as part of caring, as part of understanding one another, as part of building deeper connections with one another. And it's really part of the theme of this presentation as well. All right, so a little bit more about me. And I did turn the captions on. No one asked, but I think it's something that I put there as an example, and that's something that Brian, you were there, that presentation where we figured out how to make sure that this was working. So I identify as Chinese American. I was actually an immigrant to this country. I came to the US at the age of 11 and really understand the ins and outs of learning multiple languages at once and being in schools and thinking as myself as a mathematics learner in a different culture. I'm also a parent, a son, a brother. I consider myself a longtime teacher educator and a scholar. And this is something that I think will come out throughout this presentation, that I really believe, and my work is really centered around this idea of disability justice. And so I don't identify myself as a disabled person, although I have a child with a disability. I do consider myself as a co-conspirator. And so some of the ideas that I'm going to share, and that's the book that Brian shared a little bit about with, that I co-authored with Alexis Padilla, Erica Mason, and James Sheldon. This is an NCTM book, and in today's presentation, I'm really building on some of the ideas there and really expanding on some of the things that we talked about in that book. Okay, so disability as thriving versus surviving. So when we think about disability, not only in schools, but also out in our world, we know that that is a space of a lot of harms, a lot of navigation, a lot of complexity. And so one thing that I want to have us think about is this idea of how do we think about our work as contributing to this idea of folks with disabilities are just trying to survive, versus how do we nurture more thriving conditions for disabled folks, both in and out of schools. And so this is, again, not just about disabled folks, but it's also about us as well. And we think about how that work of ensuring thriving of our fellow human beings means that we ourselves also thrive. And so a lot of the dynamics of thriving versus surviving fall along the lines of belonging versus like exclusion and conformity. And so again, when we think about mathematics education, to what extent do we push students to conform to what our notions of mathematics teaching and learning should be? And so this is, again, something that we could think more about. The wholeness versus deficient, lacking. Again, this is a big part of education, is to identify students' deficits and then work on interventions to address those. Again, you could hopefully see a connection between each of these bullet points, but we don't often think about what students bring, particularly students with disabilities or other multi-marginalized identities, as also as contributing to their thriving. Brian talked a little bit about intersectionality, and I think some of that conversations have happened already. So this idea I'll keep hammering home, and because it's often folks with disabilities are often just thought about as disability without thinking about their complexity of the complexities of their identity. In what I shared a little bit earlier, it's the thriving really is connected to larger ideas that we are trying to ensure for all our students, and really counter this idea of normal and abnormal, which is a big issue in discussions of disabilities, and what are the consequences of that, of thinking of someone as closer to normal, further from normal, what does normal mean, and then what the implications are that for practice. The further away from normal you are, the less likely you are to engage in the mathematics that we are all striving to work with our students. And so, one thing that I want to talk a little bit more about is this notion of ableism. And so I created a poll, and Gary, would you mind launching this poll for us here today, just to get a quick sense of your familiarity with ableism, so that when I share this concept, I can be responsive to your understanding of ableism. So take a moment to read this poll and then ask, how familiar are you with ableism, and choose one of the four choices: very familiar, somewhat familiar, little familiar, not familiar.
All right. Do you want me to go ahead and share the results?
Yeah, thank you, Gary. Okay, so I think most of you are in the BC area, so somewhat to a very or a little familiar, and then a few very familiar and not very familiar. So I'll share a little bit more about it and speak in really broad strokes about this idea of ableism, and hopefully as we go through the time today, you kind of get a better sense of what ableism is, particularly those who are not very familiar or with the idea of ableism. So one way I like to think about ableism is, I mean, it's a lot like this social hierarchy notion that there are better ways to being human beings, and so there are better ways to engage in this world that involve sight versus not having visual sight. It's better to experience this world through our two legs versus rolling. And so these are all things that are taken for granted, particularly if you fall in what most folks fall under, in this idea of normal. And so ableism is this system that operates under this notion. And so that's a really simplistic way of sharing what that is. One thing that is important that I think in thinking about ableism and disability is you could think about those as sort of the same. And another way to think about it too is that they inform one another. At the same time, it doesn't mean that if you don't identify as disabled, like ableism doesn't impact you. And so ableism impacts all of us in some way, shapes, or form. So I think that's important to think about ableism as, yes, a disability issue, and as not a disability issue at the same time. And that there's this systemic and interlocking way of thinking about ableism that is influenced and influences other systems of oppression, including racism, sexism, and other forms of isms like colonialism, for example. Any of you ever heard of this word, drapetomania? No. Okay, so drapetomania, it was considered a mental illness in the 1800s during slavery. And so this was a mental illness attributed to slaves who ran away. And so slaves who ran away were diagnosed with a mental illness of drapetomania. And so you could see how ableism, like you have a mental illness, really is confounded with issues of racism. Hysteria is another mental disorder, right, attributed to females. No longer is the case, but again, you can think about how ableism is pervasive in many aspects of our lives and history. So ableism in math education, and some may disagree with some of these, but there is this diagnosis, which is in the books. It's called dyscalculia. Folks here familiar with that term? All right, so dyscalculia, there's specific learning disabilities in mathematics, there's working memory issues. I mean, all of these, to me, are ableism that materializes in our field. So the big idea is that this idea of intersectionality, because ableism is not isolated, it is intersectional with other forms of oppression, that we must really heed the call of the Combahee River Collective, which really urges us to think about how do we dismantle all of these systems of oppression? Because if we do that, then we can all be free and be liberated from these ways, whether we are the oppressors or we are the oppressed. All right, I'm gonna run through a real quick synthesis of where we are in terms of how ableism affects our practices, our research. And so this really pulls in different works that I've been doing with others for many years around disability and math education. And so one thing that, the really quick rundown of this is that students with disabilities in mathematics are conceptualized very differently. And again, this might not surprise you, but I'll share a little bit about the results of how that plays out and how our research really highlights how ableism is prevalent, both, again, in research and in practice. And some good news. Although there are we're deeply enmeshed in ableist notions in our field and in the field of special education as well, is that there are a lot of anti-ableist scholarships going on. And I'm going to share a little bit about what that might mean for the group here in terms of moving forward. And then to take a counter to that, good news is that the not so great news, and this has been an issue in our field for I think since its inception in mathematics education, is that we often are very hesitant. We don't want to have conversations about oppressive nature such as racism. And so when we think about, okay, Paulo and others are asking you to think about ableism, well, we're not even talking about racism. And so when we think about the intersectionalities of racism and ableism, then that means we have a really long ways to go. So give you some of the good and the bad of kind of where we are as far as disability and math research. And in just a few minutes, I'm going to ask you to kind of think about, what questions I might raise for you. We're going to get into small groups to have this discussion, and so just have this question percolating in your mind and thinking about it. And after I share a few more slides, then we'll get into small breakout rooms. Okay, so the idea of like how students with disabilities are conceptualized in mathematics is really born out of this research that Rachel Lambert and I did for a long time, and we really examined lots of articles, and what we did was separate those into two buckets, if you will: research on students with disabilities only, and research on students without disabilities. And so we were able to determine that there are two separate buckets, roughly, from these 2,000 articles or so. And so some of you are familiar with these results that came out a few years ago, and even prior to that, but you could kind of see the differences there. The red represents the research on students with disability. The blue bar represents research on students without disabilities. And again, hopefully you could see some very stark differences between the two groups in terms of what are the research methods that are used as a proportion of each of the sets. You could also see other results which looks at the approaches, so the pedagogical approaches, and again, the red are the sets with disabled students, and the blue are the sets with students without disabilities. And again, you could see a really stark difference between the two sets, where students with disabilities are research on certain approaches, certain pedagogical approaches in math, whereas students without disabilities have a variety, if you will, but more focused on constructivist approaches. So that's, again, something that came out of that research. And there's quite a bit, and I'm just sharing a few of them. And this is an important aspect, I think, that is a good segue into another aspect of the research, is that you could see that there about a big difference, again, between studies that focused on students only versus studies that also included educators or teachers. And so in this finding, we noticed that students without disabilities had more studies, or a high proportion of studies, that included educators, whereas very few of the studies with students with disability had this educator. So the unit analysis, in other words, have always been on the students. Again, this disabilities as something that's focused on the individual student, as we talked a little bit earlier today. And so the next research really picks up on this idea of like, okay, so let's then look at studies that have a focus on educators. And so all of these studies really cover about a decade of studies. And we said, okay, we're going to take a look at the research that included educators, included disabilities, and we're in the context of mathematics, and see, what's happening. And so this is what I'm talking about when I shared earlier that there are anti-ableist work going on, a scholarship going on here, which shows that about half of the studies, so out of the 60 studies that we examined, about half really took on a more anti-ableist approach, if you will. So really counter the notion that I share, that students are with disabilities. We approach it with an interventionist to fix certain missing aspects of their math education. And again, here's the bad news, if you will, is that out of the 61 studies, really 2 of them took on an intersectional approach. Again, taking race and disability together meaningfully in ways that furthers our understanding of the complexities of these issues. So again, I'm just going back to the slide I shared earlier with just some quick bullet points of 15 years or so of research, that where we are, what we know. And so I think this is a good opportunity then to take a pause and to process, to reflect, and to have time with your colleagues to share a little bit of what's coming up for you in terms of what questions are coming up as you got to observe and notice the different things. I went through that. It's kind of fast, I know, and so we'll take, let's say, 7 minutes to get into our small groups and process this and have this discussion. I'm going to post, if you would like to have someone share a little bit about your group's ideas on the Jamboard, that could be a space to share those as well. So yeah, thanks, Deb, for putting that link there, and Brian. And so Deb, are we good to set up our breakout rooms? All right. Thank you so much for engaging in that discussion. And so I got a chance to read some of your postings. So thank you so much for doing that. And I think some of the questions we are hopefully going to have some, I'm going to have some offerings to. I think those are really good questions. And for me, they are very difficult questions because, for example, with working with special education colleagues, I mean, that's, I think, been a big issue for a very long time. And we often don't have many meaningful ways to do that. And so I think that's a really important question that we will continue to try to tackle. So I'm going to share a little bit more. I'm going to have us dig into another aspect here of this work, and then hopefully we can tie this together with the questions and the wonderings that you are having from this first small group. All right, so let me see here. Okay, so when we talk about this idea of inclusion as something that is an issue that crosses both special education and mathematics education. And so what I think another set of data that's important for us to think about, because we know how important opportunities are for all students to engage in the mathematics that we want to engage. So the questions about like special education and explicit instruction, we kind of know what happens when students with disabilities have exclusive work with folks with special education, because as you noted in the Jamboard, that explicit instruction tends to be the case. And so what does that mean then when we think about this notion of inclusion? And so we have data on inclusion, and we can infer from that data what happens with inclusion in mathematics education. So taking like this notion, as I mentioned before, of belonging as inclusion, if we want to think more in our field of mathematics education, it's important to kind of, again, know the context, like who's being included, who's not being included. And so we have that data, this national data about the percentage of students who spend a high proportion of time in general education classroom. Now, this doesn't mean just mathematics, but this just means in general education classrooms. And so that number is 63%. So 63% of students with disability spend most of their time in general education classroom. What do you think about that percentage? You like it? You don't know too much about it or dislike it? I see a thumbs down from Gary. Any other? Yeah, Gary says, let's look at the reverse, right? 37% don't. Yeah, lower. Probably can't be. Are you saying lower for
percentage of students in general education? I would say that the amount of time the students in elementary school spend in specific classrooms for disabled students might be higher than at the secondary level. I have seen more inclusion at the secondary level.
Okay. Yeah, that's different than I think what I think. I think inclusion tends to be more welcomed when students are younger. As they age, the academics and those concerns take over. So inclusion for the secondary, I would say, would be less. But that's really interesting. Yeah, Mary, be a big portion of the students that would not feel like they belong. So again, this is just a indicator of belonging. If that's a good indicator at all, that's even questionable. And so that's the data we have about inclusion. And if we think about how have we made progress on this number? So again, I'll just share the progress that we have here with the data that we have, which 10 years ago, or the most 2019 is the most recent set of data that we have. If we look back to 10 years before that, we're really looking at this top bar graph here, or this top line graph, which shows that we've made some strides, if you will, over the last 10 years of the data that we have. Again, with that 80% or more, or high percentage of time. Again, you can kind of think about, well, is that enough progress? Is that stalling progress? And again, you could see, even looking back at a bigger time period as well. And this is, I think, also important to note, as I think this is part of the conversation as well. A lot of the work in mathematics education, we focus a lot on a set of disabilities, and that tends to be the learning disabilities. As I mentioned earlier, the ones that are closer to normal, like folks who think we can be closer to normal, we tend to focus on that group. And as you can see with this value of tables, is that based on the disability, it varies widely as far as like who is included more than others. Again, does this mean belonging? That's questionable, but even just looking at the data, we could see that. And think about the intersectionality of Black and brown students who are labeled as in certain categories disproportionately more than in other categories. So think about emotional disabilities, think about intellectual disabilities. Those tend to be where Black and brown students are overrepresented. And again, couple that with the inclusion rate of those disabilities is important as well. So again, we can have a little some more time to think about what does that mean. I went through that really quickly because I want you to kind of keep thinking about what would that mean. So now we talked about the landscape of the math and disabilities. We talk about inclusion as preparing teachers to teach all students. Yet, if we're thinking we are working with general math educators, that means we only have knowledge or understanding of certain disabilities. And what does that mean when we talk about students who are not in the general education classroom? Again, you've got to talk a little bit about that, because you know what happens in segregated spaces. So putting all that together, like, what does that mean for you in terms of program work, in terms of, again, thinking more about the issues here? So we'll take another opportunity to have this conversation, and then we'll come back and I'll close out with some offerings of where we could think more about. So Deb, would you mind putting folks back into groups that they were in earlier? We could take about 5 minutes. All right, some really great questions. In the interest of time, there are so many things. I will just like briefly touch upon this question about dyscalculia, because it came up in this discussion prior to this discussion. And so I think a good way to think about dyscalculia is to figure out, like, how is that determined? Like, who determines that? Because at our end, as mathematics educators, mathematics teacher educators, mathematics teachers, we just get the end result. Okay, this kid has this thing called dyscalculia. This is what it means. And for me, and I think for us to think about, is like, how do they determine this? And do you agree with that determination? And so I mentioned that because there is a big issue in our field with how that's determined, and who determines that, and the types of assessments that are used to determine that. And so Elizabeth de Freitas and Natalie Sinclair have written about this, and it's really like fascinating to me in how that is determined, and for you to determine, like, yeah, is this really mean like someone can't do it? So that's how I think about that. That's how as the ableism, it's like someone's determining that you can't do what they think you should be able to do, how you should be able to do it, right? And so I think that counters our notion of what it means to be a mathematics doers and thinkers, and especially when you narrow down mathematics doers and thinkers to a very specific thing in a response at a very specific time at an assessment that is used in the very specific ways. That means you have this inability to do calculations. You have this inability to visualize things. And so that is how I see it as ableism. So just again, real quick kind of touch base. There are a lot of great questions that I would love to address. But I think in the interest of time, I'm going to move on here and talk a little bit about some of these other aspects of this work. Okay, so the question of inclusion again is really, you know, does this mean belonging? And I would say for the most part, no, it doesn't mean belonging, because there's a lot of work to do, and inclusion in short is really something that masks exclusion in a lot of ways. So how do we think about anti-ableism? And I think this is an offer to the questions that you asked about, like, what does that mean for us to have conversation with folks who think very differently than we do? And so I think, like, if we approach this work as anti-ableist, then I think those conversations could be more generative, that we can come together and say, like, I don't think anybody would be proud to say I'm an ableist, but if we say we are all anti-ableist, then we can work together to something that have a little bit common grounds. And there are going to be a lot of contradictions. I say, well, I'm doing anti-ableist work. Oh, but I'm doing this. And I'm not saying that it only happens in special education. It happens with us too, as math educators as well. So there's that divide is really, again, very problematic. And at the same time, if we think about an anti-ableist approach, I think that rifle presence is something I will offer. And I think you all have talked about this in your previous conversation, is, again, to sum it up in really quick ways, is that it's about calling out the wrongs and to help right the wrongs. And so again, special educators, math educators, whoever, we are about righting the wrongs, as Octavia D. Butler, I think, really captures it well. And so again, the notion of inclusion is really problematic as as really way to mass inclusion. And I see rifle present as an anti-ableist approach. And there's going to be quite a bit here that you will find true as far as the left side of this table, which is about inclusion. and the many issues that are associated with inclusion. So again, we think about inclusion as that's great. We should have everybody included. At the same time, we should question what do we mean by inclusion? And so a lot of that you will notice on the left side of the column. And I'm going to contrast that with a anti-ableist approach, which is rightful presence. And it really builds on the work of Calabrese Barton and Edna Tan in thinking about this space in particular when we are thinking about the intersection of two fields of mathematics education and special education. And so inclusion is an extension of rights that could be really taken away anytime, like you are included or you're not included because, you know, whatever the case is, right? A lot of ableist things, right? You can't do your math. You don't have your multiplication facts. You can't behave a certain way. So you are definitely included and there are certain conditions, but not in the other conditions. So that is inclusion in most cases. But rightful presence is not that. It is really about working with students to make the space inclusive, make it that everybody has a rightful presence to that space, to a mathematics learning community. And so it's constant work. It's not about booting people out. It's not about something that you will be included at some point in time, as our graph has shown that 63% has been pretty steady for a long time and will likely be steady for a longer time. We'll get to it at some point. Rightful presence is unapologetically about it's immediate. And again, the burdens of inclusion is always on the folks that we want to be included or are asking to be included. Whereas the burden is on all of us. And we, again, circle back to what we started off today's meeting with is like access. This is a burden on us to ensure access to the space that we're in. And so it's on all of us. And it's really goes beyond including us in a space as Dr. Martin Luther King talked about a burning house. Like, why do we want folks included in the space that is just corrupt, that has a lot of issues? But rightful presence is about dismantling those issues. It's about putting out the fire, about making something better. And so it's constant work. It is associated with a lot of other systems addressing other systems of oppression. So that's a lot of information, and that's really an offering because it is something that is significant. It's going to take a lot because inclusion is not ever going to do what we think it's going to do because of the host of problems that it has. And so I'm just going to close out here with a couple of thoughts. There's some work that's been done in science, and I talked a little bit about that. Again, is that when we talk about students with disabilities, we think about, okay, if we could just make these accommodations, if we could have them be and think like us, then that will help, right? And so that's an accommodation-based approach, which aligns a lot with inclusion. And then the issue of disability ableism is not just a one-off, like we're going to do this in a special education course. And then we're going to departmentalize that. That's special education. We're going to defer that, right? And that is not the work that I think is important as we think about this work that we do in teacher education, and in thinking about how that is really embedded within other systems of oppression, and think about that in intersectional ways, because again, we don't want to do what we're doing, saying special education, disabilities, that is deferred. We are only normal students or close to normal students. And so a big question for us, I think, is like, who are we centering this work? I think the answer should be hopefully a little bit clearer at this time. And so I want to offer, again, us an opportunity to think about what is our role here. Then we spent this Thursday afternoon or morning in the space thinking, getting quite a bit of complex ideas ran through in a very fast time. And so what do we what is our role with rifle presence? What do we do with this? Well, how do we connect it to larger liberation movements that occur in our math space and beyond? And I want to close with the quote from June Jordan, like, we are the ones we've been waiting for. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Paulo. Amazing. I see everybody's clapping or figuring out how to push the button to clap. Thank you all. We know we're a minute or two over. I'm sure, well, I can't speak for him, but I suspect Paul will be willing to stick around for a minute or two if you have a question or a comment or wish to discuss. But for all of you who have stayed a little bit longer than your calendar allows, it's great to see you all, and we'll see you again soon. Paulo, do you mind if I put a link to the slides into the chat?
No, I think we were trying to share it while you all were in the breakout rooms, but it didn't work. So, yeah, feel free to share that slide.
But again, go ahead, Lorraine. I was going to
Paulo, I was just going to ask, is it okay if I share this with my students as well, my undergraduates? Because I'm teaching methods with math ed and future special ed teachers. And we've read some of your work and Rachel's work, and I told them about this, but I didn't think about it until yesterday. Otherwise, maybe they would have joined. So I would love to be able to share this with them if that's okay.
I'm fine with that.
And I also put in, because my group, I didn't get a chance, we, for our AMTE MTEP presentation, so a bunch of people on the call were a part of that. We did put together some, like, just a collection of resources. It is not well curated because we're just learning, right? But I put the link in there. And so I don't know if like Gary or Brian, if this goes out to the MTEP or on our open canvas or anything, if maybe that link can also just be included, because it's just a list of our resources. And I could maybe put it there. I don't know. I don't know if I have access to do that kind of stuff, but
We'll make sure it's there.
okay.
Paula, I have questions, and I'm trying to edit out the ones that are just like too big, I guess. Because part of me is thinking about, like, in my goal for preparing secondary math teachers, I'm always having them imagine the math teaching that in the school and the classrooms that you would like to have, and go out and survive and thrive in your first few years and then begin working towards it. I don't want them to lose sight of the idea. But then there's certain small little things that I know I can equip them with that they can make immediate impact with. And I think one that is very simple to impact is how you're really just changing the norm by routinizing that question of what access needs, like what are your access needs to begin classes or to begin my lectures and so on. Are there any other, I don't know a better word to say other than small or simple things that you've noticed can make a pretty significant impact, either in our roles preparing teachers or maybe that our students can do in their own classrooms?
You're talking about working with like prospective teachers, correct?
Sure. Or even, yes.
Well, I think one thing that I think has helped is and this is actually pretty hard to do, I think. I mean, it's not like doing the access need kind of thing. That's pretty straightforward. Is having them engage with this idea of students with disabilities, and particularly like disabled students of colors, as having gifts or as brilliance, because that is, like, for many folks and many folks maybe here in this call, like, that's really hard to understand. Like, what does that mean? And so when that happens, it really pushes them to think about their students really differently. And so when I do this, students are often in the field, and then they're doing either student teaching or they're observing teachers. And so that that is a step that gets them to understand their students and to have conversations with their students, to observe their students in like very different ways. Like, what are their gifts? Well, that's hard. How do I do that? Like, what do I do? What do I observe? Well, that's your assignment, is to, what are their math gifts? And so it takes a while, and this takes, I think in the chat, I noticed like a mind shift, like a different orientation, because we often, like in mathematics, we want to say, okay, what are the learning gaps? What can't they do? That's easy. And we do that. Now we'll ask them, like, what are their gifts, and how do we work within different areas that we can, with curriculum, with pedagogy, with relationships with our students, that can enhance, that can get at that understanding better, and then help make the conditions to help them thrive. So that is like the opposite of this simple way. It's actually, it takes, for me, I've experienced that takes multiple semesters, and I've have the opportunity to do that with some teachers, and that has helped. So it's a deeper, for me, like a deeper way of unlearning ableism in a lot of ways.
I have a question. How do you do away with that ableism that is going to be enmeshed in a teacher that has an IEP for a student and has already a label and limits? It's very hard to move away from that shell. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
And I don't know how you help the teachers navigate what the law requires with what we've been talking about.
Well, I think that's part of the conversation too with programs, is to think about, like, again, IEPs are a special education thing. However, general education teachers are part of the team that contributes to the IEP. And so I think there's also an opportunity there to have further conversations. Okay, you learn about IEPs in this course. Like, what does that mean for mathematics education? Because we often, again, we don't have these conversations about IEP work. And for me, like, I think IEPs are like, like you said, it hinders a lot. At the same time, it can be a leverage at the same time, because just because of my experiences, I know a lot of the ins and outs of the IEPs that many folks don't. And so there are a lot of opportunities in IEPs to push practices, not only for that student, but also for your classroom practices as well, because it is designed in some ways to be, for good or bad, open-ended and flexible. And so there are opportunities there to recast the IEP against, again, ableism, and towards something that we think is important in pushing as mathematics educators that have a seat at that table.
Thank you.
One of the questions I had is how this may parallel or intersect with issues around ELL, because it seems like there may be some parallelism, or do you see this as sort of running on different tracks?
Yeah, I do see a lot of overlaps, and I think that's an area that, again, with intersectionality, we don't think about, okay, that's ELL, right? That's special education, that's race, and so we think about those as separate things, but there is a big need actually to think about the work of disability and language as working, again, in concert in many ways, in the support or no support. I mean, all these things are things we need to consider in our field, and we haven't I know folks who are doing a lot of work with language, and they're doing amazing work. However, like we haven't worked like together on that work, and I think that's definitely an area that I read their work, and I notice that there are a lot of things that we're saying that are very similar, and that we can definitely enrich one another's work through an intersectional approach. Brian, I saw your note about the Sinclair. I'll send that to you so you all could have that. That's a fascinating article about dyscalculia. So
Yeah, that's what it was. Thank you.
yeah.
I think I have one more question. If you could speak to a large urban school district's math specialist, math lead, what sorts of things would you encourage that person to consider in their program?
Ooh.
He's here in the room. I'm sorry. To be transparent.
Call him out, Brian. So I didn't have to do it.
I mean, I think that is for me like an ongoing work that a lot of interest comes from leaders, like school leaders. They're really interested in this work, like because they see a big need, and they don't see much in terms of like resources. So I would say, like from that leadership stance, I think it's important like to call out like what we are for, what we are against. I mean, because that will make the work so much easier. I mentioned that idea of anti-ableism. Like if we, I know very few organizations. I don't think I can name any organization that have said that we're anti-ableist organization. I heard we're anti-racist. That's pretty common. So if we're an anti-ableist organization, then and people say, yeah, we are. We don't have anything against that. And so we do that work, and then we call out, well, that's ableist, so that's inconsistent with what we're about. And then I mean that again, that's not, you know, just putting a label like that's not going to fix anything, but that ensures that we have those conversations, because that's been my experience working in spaces where our organization has been explicitly anti-racist, and there's so many contradictions that then we need to, like, oh, we can't run away, like we can't just say, oh, that's not our work. We can't say, well, we can't do that. Like, I think that becomes for me a big part of like having these important conversations, being able to work with one another for that consistency that we seek, which like at the root of it, it's like anti-ableism. Like because just as an example, like the inclusion, I mean, you get folks that say, well, we want to include, but and then all these ableist things that happen. And so there's no but, because if you're an anti-ableist, you shouldn't be saying those things, or at least you have a conversation about why we're saying ableist things to preclude students to be in spaces where they have a rightful presence too.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for your time. And thank you, Paulo, very, very, very much for contributing to our community. We consider you an honorary and permanent member now, so expect regular emails, invitations, etc. But thank you again. Thanks, everyone, for being here. Much appreciated.